Director Jacobo Martinez brings us 13 Exorcisms, or at least that is the English translation of this Spanish movie. Yes, spoken in Spanish with subtitles, so if you're not a fan of subtitles, you may want to check out a different video. But the 13 Exorcisms, what it's all about. I will say before I go any further, this review will contain some mild spoilers. I won't reveal anything I don't have to. I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end, and I'll be as vague as I possibly can. But to have my critiques, I am going to have to kind of talk about certain plot points. But let's talk about the story first. What is the brief synopsis of this movie? It focuses on Laura, who is a 17-year-old girl living in Spain, comes from a very strict Catholic upbringing. Her parents are very into it, you might say. But she's had a fair bit of trauma in her past herself. She suffered from anorexia and anxiety, probably caused by a very strict Catholic upbringing. But also her brother seems to be severely disabled, and she's had another brother who has apparently died in a car crash. So her family's had it quite rough, you might say. Now, because of the strict upbringing, her parents don't let her go out really. So she sneaks out one night on Halloween to meet her friend, and they decide they're going to do a seance. And we all know how that turns out. So they end up doing this seance, which brings forth this demonic entity which seems to take over Laura. Or does it? Now, what happens then is we have, obviously, because of the possession kind of style movie, we get this demonic force harassing Laura, and ultimately we get the a Vatican-sanctioned priest turn up to try and give her an exorcism or two. In fact, maybe even 13. And anyway, and that's kind of your basic plot premise. Let's talk about it. What did I think works in this movie? It's a fairly solidly made film, I will start there. So broadly speaking, this movie has a fairly good production value. I mean, it's slickly produced. It's, it feels like it's had effort, time and money put behind it. It does not feel like one of these kind of like cheapest chips kind of, film it for a couple of $1,000 and bung it out as soon as possible. It looks like it has had some effort put behind it, because the production value looks good. I think the camera work, the lighting, everything like this, the VFX look to a good standard. There's some pretty good set pieces in regards to kind of demonic situations that happen within this movie, and they look kind of pretty painful and kind of quite scary to those of you who may have a nervous disposition to this kind of thing. But yeah, I thought the actual kind of whole production kind of side of things was pretty good standard here. It's always somewhat difficult to judge foreign language movies because you can't really tell the dialogue really, as I'm reading it rather than listening to the actors, so to speak. But to me, the acting seemed pretty solid. The emotional resonance that the actors are giving, physically, I thought was pretty good. And for me, at least, the acting seems all pretty solid. I will say, I think some of the characters seem a little broad, if I'm honest, and dipped into stereotypes here and there. But I will say that the acting, for the most part, is pretty solid. And the movie is peppered with quite a lot of these demonic sequences. As the film goes on, they become more violent and more overt, so to speak. But you get a good amount of spooky stuff happening on screen. It doesn't save it all for the last 15 minutes and things like that. You will get a good amount here. And there's a couple of okay jump scares. I don't think this movie was especially scary, but it's well done. And if you're familiar with these things, you will say, you will feel that you've can expect what you're going to see. And I have to say, the story is solid. It doesn't break the mold. It's very what you've seen before, but that can be a good thing if you're expecting a certain style of movie. If you're a fan of the somewhat cookie cutter story elements that you have in a possession movie, this is more of the same. So yes, it's a little unoriginal, but it's delivering what you'd probably expect from a possession movie. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It's peppered and it's relatively well paced. So to me, it was a fairly well put together movie. What doesn't work for me? So I will have to say, as I've alluded to, the story here is nothing you haven't seen before. It is just more of the same. This movie doesn't really break any new ground. There's one or two elements that I kind of quite liked. For example, our character is on like an intravenous drip, and the priest kind of blesses the solution that's going into the arms that kind of creates this internal problem for the demon that's inhabiting Laura and stuff like that. So there's one or two elements that I thought were quite fun, but they're kind of smaller things. The rest of it is very much kind of business as usual in regards to you know, the actual kind of story elements here. As I've mentioned, there's a couple of kind of like characters that seem rather broad. Her best friend seems like she doesn't really know her. It's like why, you know, how comes you're hanging out with this girl? Because you just seemed, when this sequence when they're together, it almost like they don't really know each other because she's got off going out with boys and all that sort of stuff, and it's the typical kind of bad girl thing. So there are some kind of broader kind of characters here. I'll mostly do their kind of the smaller roles, the nosy neighbour and that kind of stuff and all that. I do have a couple of issues, and this is where the spoilery stuff is gonna come in. So again, you've been warned last time. So the movie thinks it's being clever because it's trying to essentially say, is it a demon or is it some type of more mundane explanation? So we get this kind of, the whole movie is kind of suggesting that it's a demon, and we see plenty of stuff on screen. However, then we have some evidence that it could actually be a case of this girl having, you know, this very kind of strict religious upbringing, coupled with trauma in her life, and then coupled with recreational drugs, which is actually kind of causing the problem. But I have a few issues with that, if we're being honest. So again, we see about just before the halfway mark, Laura ends up in hospital, and she's on an intravenous drip. She's unconscious. If she was on drugs at that point, because the scene where she has this party is before that, they would have picked it up if they had drugs up in the system then, you know. So that whole plot point is she on recreational drugs is moot, because they would have done a blood test, and because she's like passed out and, you know, a young girl, they would think, is she on drugs? They would have done a blood test. So it strikes me as silly that wasn't even kind of commented on, so to speak. She's in hospital, and yet no one says anything about that she's on any drugs. A little bit silly, if you're asking me. And then we have a sequence again where she attacks a boy at school. I'll put that scene clip of it at least at the beginning of the video, and it's never mentioned. The boy was clearly injured, if that was a real kind of sequence, you know, not a kind of a hallucination and things like this. And what's happened, because if she had done what was happening in that sequence, there would have been a police presence. You know, what happened to that boy? Was he killed? Was he injured? We don't know. I mean, it's kind of like, I think the movie's trying to suggest, did it really happen, or was it kind of just a figment of the imagination? But the movie doesn't do a good enough job of really, I think, being fair in explaining that, because we kind of see demonic things happen to other characters, not just Laura, that are kind of in her vicinity, witnessing things. So the movie is definitely suggesting that there is a kind of a demonic force there, but then it wants you to kind of question if it's really a kind of a demonic force, or is it this kind of more mundane kind of explanation. And I think the movie could have been a little bit more subtle and really giving you the audiences to question it, because the movie's quite clearly kind of suggesting that this movie, the protagonist is possessed, rather than it's kind of a this subplot where she could just be having trauma and stuff. So I think the movie thinks it's more clever than it actually is, because it kind of undoes some of that kind of evidence that is actually, suggesting that it could have been more of a mundane situation. So I know that's the more fantastical kind of route, and doesn't seem as logical, but you know, when you see what's happened and witnesses see what, you know, things happen to them and in their vicinity that's clearly not normal and not what drugs would do, and we as an audience, I think, really never would think she's actually on drugs, and it is obviously a possession. You know, I'm not saying that was what happened in medical terms, but in regards to this movie at least. So I think that whole plot point is rather moot and kind of like it doesn't really kind of work. It ends up kind of having this sort of B storyline that I think is poorly kind of put together. So that's the kind of the I think a big issue with some of this kind of the script here. It is, you know, it is kind of, it doesn't help itself. You know, it kind of paints itself in a corner, but I don't think really kind of realises it. So I have to say, I do think this movie is worth seeing if you are a possession or an Exorcist kind of style movie fan. You know, it's not as clever as maybe as it thinks it is, and certainly not as clever as other, you know, Exorcist style movies. But it's a decent watch. You know, it's well put together. Had it been a little smarter, I think this movie could have exceeded. You know, the kind of the more generic, no frills kind of movie that it kind of ends up being. Somewhat kind of lackluster, I guess, but certainly not bad, certainly watchable. And I will say probably slightly above average because the production design is good. Maybe it's not as scary as some. It doesn't quite have that kind of like that wow factor, but it's watchable. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.